Good afternoon, welcome, thank you for joining us. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about software architecture. Those of you who know me, you know I created the C4 model, a bunch of other stuff, etc., etc. A few people have stopped me in the corridor and asked me, am I going to talk about anything new? And the answer is no. Quite the opposite, actually. So this is my slide to set the scene. Please don't take too much offense quite yet. But I've seen lots of talks over the past few years about all the socio-technical stuff and DDD and Agile and Spotify model and team topologies and all of this stuff is good. However, it still doesn't work if you don't have good technical principles in place. And I can't stress that enough. So that's essentially the driving force that kind of prompted me to put this session together. And I guess the other way to think about this is very simply, you can't optimize team performance, and of course that's what a lot of these things are all about. You can't optimize team performance without good technical foundations. And I think this is one of those unfortunate aspects we've completely neglected over the past 10, maybe 20 plus years or so. I went to a bunch of talks yesterday, and the theme running through some of them was this kind of battle, this conflict, this tension between autonomy versus alignment. And of course, it's worth remembering that this works at different levels, different scales. So you've got alignment and autonomy inside an individual product team, and you've got the same happening at bigger scales in the organization, enterprise architecture and very strategic kind of future-facing stuff. One of the ways I think about this is I always drop back to something like elastic leadership. Different teams need different leadership styles. Sometimes you need to go in and to kind of tell people what to do because they don't know how to solve their own problems. And other times you need to remove blockers and let the team do its thing because they are truly autonomous. You can also factor the decision-making process on top of this. Andrew Harmon-Law, in his book, he goes through a whole bunch of different decision-making processes. And again, all of this stuff is tied together, of course. Now, from my perspective, a lot of you know me for the C4 model for visualizing architecture. So I'm going to bring this back to diagrams, you'll be pleased to know. And I like to use this as a nice baseline for everything we're going to talk about, really. This is a screenshot from Thomas Betts. He's one of the InfoQ editors. He did a session a while back about leveling up your architecture game. And he says, every software problem is fundamentally a communication problem. The biggest impact a software architect can make is by improving communication. And this, for me, hits the nail on the head. I've seen so many issues in organizations, big and small, that can be solved by focusing on communication. So what am I actually going to talk about? Well, I'm not going to talk about anything new. I'm going to talk about all the stuff I've been doing over the past 15 plus years, essentially. This is a retrospective. It's a reflection of my work all around the world. And I've witnessed a massive, huge shift of how architecture is perceived over the past 15 plus years, since the Agile manifesto was created and sometime after that. So I'm going to take you back in time. In 2008, so in 2008, I was working in London. I moved back to Jersey in the Channel Islands, which is where I live now. I proposed a book called From Developer to Architect. And this is going to be a nice, hands-on, pragmatic guide around software architecture. And I thought, this is awesome. This is what's needed. There's a bunch of architecture books out there. They're a bit dry. They're a bit boring. I want to kind of tell people how to do architecture. And I'd already written some books. So if you go back, dig through my CV on LinkedIn, you'll find I'm the author and co-author of a bunch of Java books. So I had some contacts in the industry, and I'd also done some technical reviewing and stuff. So I thought this is going to be an easy sell. So I put my proposals together for this book. And all the publishing companies went, nah. I was like, oh. It was just at the wrong time. The Agile Manifesto had come along 7 years earlier. Everybody's focusing on Agile and agility and all of that other stuff, and architecture was seen as this uncool, old-fashioned thing. And they just did not think an architecture book would sell. In 2011, I spoke at Go to Aarhus, which was awesome. I can see Ino nodding. This is a fabulous event in the most amazing venue you've ever seen. My talk was called The Frustrated Architect. And I'd already been seeing signs of organizations dumping and ditching design and architectural techniques and diagrams and documentations. And I could just see this is not going to end well. And here's a screenshot of my slide deck. This is basically still what I'm teaching people in my workshops today. I'm just going to zoom in on a few of these slides very briefly. Whenever you introduce yourself as a software architect back in 2011, people used to sneer at you. They're like, okay, interesting, but not part of our new shiny Agile world, I'm afraid. And that was a bit weird, so you had to kind of say, well, I'm actually just a tech lead, I'm a hands-on software architect. You kind of had to reframe your introductions to people. And there was lots of talks about self-organizing teams and again, autonomy and acceptance testing and unit testing and XP and emergent design and all of this kind of cool Agile stuff. And lots of this stuff is great. But there was no focus on the other stuff as well. You know, architecture drivers, non-functional requirements, doing things properly, performance, scaling, security, the sorts of problems teams are still having today, of course. And I said this, I said, I've seen a bunch of organizations try the flat self-organizing team thing, and I have seen instances of where it does work, but I don't think it works universally. And that was met with some backlash, and I'm going to come back to this slide a little bit later because I have another interesting story for you. And basically I said, look, we've done a bunch of stuff in the past, and we've thrown it all away. You know, there's a bunch of good stuff that we can still use today, essentially. It's funny that this conference is called Agile Meets Architecture, because back in 2011, I had 2 slides in my slide deck. This is the first. Does Agile need architecture? Yeah, because it's about bringing some structure to some of the newer ways of working and things like that. And my second slide was, does architecture need Agile? And I'm like, yes, because it's been perceived as this horrible, big, heavyweight, upfront design thing, and it needs to be trimmed down and made more lightweight. And what's really interesting is the clients who get me in, they come from one of these 2 camps. They're either old-fashioned, traditional software development houses who want to make things more lightweight, more lean, more agile, or they're organizations who have been through the Agile transformation and they're lacking some structure. One of the final slides in this talk was this: how much design should we do? And I said, well, just enough. Now, this is a great thing to say, it's a great mantra, but look at the little bullet points here. Understand how the significant elements fit together, so high-level structure, mitigate your key risks, and provide some vision and foundations. This is exactly the same stuff I'm talking about today. So I did this talk, I thought it was great. It probably wasn't great, it's on YouTube, you can watch it and decide for yourself. I got this feedback. It was like, well, that's all very interesting, but I think you're exaggerating. I think you've presented a straw man. And I was quite upset by that. 2012, I did a talk called Master Builder, the original generalizing specialist. What an awful talk name. But essentially it was about software architects and the software architecture role and how it should be essentially about coding, coaching, and collaboration. That was the crux of the thing, and I did this whole comparison between the building world and the software world and the roles and, you know, apprenticeships and all that good stuff. And I did this talk in Amsterdam. Now, the Dutch people are known for being a little bit direct occasionally, and this Dutch guy came up to me after the talk and said, interesting, but do you have any evidence? I'm like, no. And it turns out this guy was a PhD student, and he was big into academia, and I'd kind of presented lots of stories and anecdotes, and he wanted some Harvard evidence that these sorts of things actually worked. 5 minutes later, the same guy came back to me and said, oh, by the way, I'm doing a PhD. I'm really looking for a project I can do as a thesis, and my suggestion was, what you can do is look into all the stuff I've talked about. He's like, no, that sounds like a lot of work. So this was kind of his point. You know, you've told lots of stories, but that doesn't make data. And then, of course, we have the diagram stuff. So I presented a whole bunch of talks called Effective Architecture Sketches. This was kind of before C4 had the C4 branding. It was just the way I drew diagrams. And you couldn't really submit a talk to a conference that had the words architecture diagram in, because that was like a no-no. You know, we didn't do architecture diagrams anymore. We were doing Martin Fowler's UML as a sketch and whiteboards and conversations. And there was no real kind of content around software architecture diagrams and making sure that stuff was done well. And I did a whole bunch of diagramming workshops, essentially the same workshop I'm doing today. And I ran this particular workshop with a conference year after year. And he eventually started asking me this every time I turned up: did you bring your crayons? Like, really? Just FYI, I was running the biggest workshops at his conference. We had like 30 people. All the other workshops were like 6 people behind laptop screens. But he kind of said, well, yeah, this looks fun and interesting, but it's fun and interesting. How is it helping real people? And the final story I'll share with you here, I spoke at an enterprise architecture conference, again about diagramming, and before I went on stage, the guy who introduced me said, and welcome to Bob the Builder. And he showed a gigantic picture of Bob the Builder. If you don't know who Bob the Builder is, please go look up Bob the Builder on Google. Why was he calling me Bob the Builder? Because this was an enterprise architecture conference. I'm there talking about drawing diagrams and being a hands-on architect and writing code, and it was just a different world. And yeah, he thought it was funny. I did not think it was funny. So where are we now? Well, it turns out I'm back on trend. Right, I've been talking about the same stuff since 2008, 2010. And architecture is it's been an off-trend thing. It's been very unfashionable, but now I'm back because everybody's talking about architecture. There's architecture books coming out from O'Reilly. There's architecture stuff on the InfoQ graphy thing. The Tech Radar ThoughtWorks has got architecture stuff on it. In terms of myself, I did publish my book. I published my book on LeanPub. My 2 books have 27,000 readers each. Those are not all sold. I do give some away to workshops and things. But yeah, I've had publishing companies approach me and say, hey, can we publish a book? And I'm like, nope. My book is in the top 20. So one book is number 4, the other one is number 14. Interest around things like design and architecture. You know, this is my talk from last time I was here. It still baffles me that lots of people find this super interesting. Like it's a talk about the lost art of software design. My C4 talk's got nearly 500,000 views. This is a talk about drawing boxes and arrows properly. It's just astounding. If you think that's funny, check this out. Myself, Dave Farley, and Hannes Louette, we did like a sit-down thing at GoTo. 3.1 million views. The topic is design. Why? We have no idea why it's got so many views. I reckon Dave wrote a botnet. So I've been running software architecture workshops internally and externally since 2008. And actually, I think the plural of anecdote is actually data. I've done this a lot. How much? Since 2010, I've got 200 plus clients all around the world where I've done architecture workshops in literally every single domain and discipline you can possibly imagine. My background's kind of mostly consulting for finance, and I think people assume I'm just in finance. But as this shows, I've literally got customers in every domain you can imagine. And this is all around the world. This is not just kind of UK-focused stuff. Last year alone, I did 21 workshops. Most of those were private workshops. And I did a whole bunch of conference talks, both at public conferences and internal stuff. So I often do things like talks for R&D departments and engineering departments within organizations because they have a bunch of issues I can help them solve. In terms of who is engaging me, it's all of these sorts of folks. You know, these are folks with visibility across the organization. They can see the types of issues that engineering teams are having, and they want to try and solve these things. So a big part of what I do is a software architecture diagramming exercise. I'm sure I've told you this a million times before. There's 2 variations of this. The first variation is, here are some requirements, break up into little groups, go do some design. And the exercise is phrased like this. If you want to know more about this exercise and kind of the rationale behind the exercise, I would definitely go and point you to the talk I did here last time. However, since that talk, there have been 2 interesting themes and questions that have come out of this. The first one is, we don't want to tell developers what to do. And I see a big hesitation around making technology choices and making design choices during this workshop, because the people doing the design don't want to tell developers what to do. And I think that's really interesting. The answer, of course, is to collaborate. It's to get the developers doing the design exercise. It's to change the landscape. It's not that we're trying to tell people what to do, but it kind of shows that some of these organizations don't have a good collaborative way of working. And the other interesting question I've seen recently is this. Should we allow our architecture diagrams to influence our design? Now, of course, an architecture diagram should just be a representation of the thing you are designing, building, changing, modifying, whatever. But it's also a feedback loop. If you have some complicated architecture in mind, some Lambda-based architecture in mind, some microservices-based architecture in mind, and you can't draw a sufficiently simple picture, you don't cheat with the picture. Maybe you use that as a feedback loop and simplify your design. And I've seen this time and time again during the design exercise. So people are like, how do we make this diagram simpler? It's too complicated. Answer, simplify your design. So I do think there's an interesting feedback loop here. So that's the design part of the workshops. The other way I really like to run my workshops when I'm doing private workshops for organizations is this. Create yourselves in little groups, go away for 30 minutes, and draw some diagrams of something you know. A product, a service, a system that you know. And this is really interesting. It turns out in 30 minutes, I can tell an awful lot about your organization. Kenny and Evelyn talked about dominance and ranking, and I've most definitely seen that during these exercises. People who are highly ranked in the organization just completely sidetracking the discussion. And that's awesome for me to see, but it's awesome for other people to see as well. I've seen a bunch of diagrams produced during the exercise that are just fully top-down without any implementation details. Now, interesting story for you. Fellow speaker, not at this conference, a bunch of other conferences, he was doing some consulting for a UK-based company and asked me to come in and do my workshop. The thing you should know about my workshop is that I charge a single flat fee on the basis that companies can bring as many people as they like. 10, 20, 100, don't care, bring them all along, plant the seeds, et cetera, et cetera. So this organization, they had a small number of senior architects, like 6 or 7 senior architects, and that was the bunch of people they wanted on this workshop. And they said to me, to get value for money, we're going to also bring some of our junior developers so they can learn what it might be like to be an architect. Right, so you know where this is going already. So we do this exercise. There are 2 iterations. Iteration 1 was just carnage. It was a car crash. We reviewed the diagrams. They were horrible. We introduce C4. We do a bunch of reviews. We take a second attempt. The groups of architects, they drew the system context diagrams, which are top-down, nice and high level, and then they stopped. And the exercise was, well, can you draw some C4 container diagrams to show the implementation details? And at that point, they started making excuses like, oh, we have stuff to do, this is not our world, the developers to do it. And I started to get a little bit suspicious. So we do this whole thing, and at the end of the workshop, I was feeling a bit kind of deflated by the whole thing because the junior developers actually did a pretty good job. Okay, so they struggled with some of the architecture stuff because they'd only been in the industry for like 2, 3, 4 years, but they did a pretty good job with the diagrams. The senior architects had no idea what was going on. So a few weeks later, I bump into this friend of mine, and he says, that workshop you did, amazing, thank you very much. I'm like, what? He said, no, that workshop was absolutely incredible. And I said to him, well, I didn't feel that same way. I just felt like I kind of showed the architects as people who don't know what they're doing is exactly. And it turns out I'd been set up. He got me in to basically showcase that these people who had architect on their job title were just completely hopeless. And that's not the first time or the last time that's happened. On the flip side, I've seen architecture diagrams that are essentially just bottom-up visualizations of code. Most recently, a bunch of people basically drew like a clean architecture ports and adapters template diagram. And they said, this is what our system looks like. And I said, well, that's nice, but it's a bit kind of too detailed and we're missing the top-down view. And I've also seen instances where particularly small startups and scale-ups have hired people from FAANG companies, and they've been driving the discussion, saying, well, at Facebook, we did X, and we should do X here as well, and that's probably not suitable for that smaller company's context. I did a workshop earlier this year, And it was the same thing, like draw me some diagrams of a product that you are working on. And this particular group, they drew 3 products and a slice across the 3 products. And I looked at this, and I thought, I know what's going on here. You're organized into feature teams. And they said, how did you know that? And it's weird how people's perceptions of teams influences the diagrams. Now, I do appreciate that software architecture is much more than boxes and arrows, but teams still get this badly wrong. If you're not able to craft up a bunch of decent architecture diagrams, if you're not able to communicate effectively, so much other stuff can't happen effectively. So the sorts of problems that organizations approach me to fix, we don't have a standard way to discuss our products from an engineering perspective. Super, super common. Our lack of documentation is slowing us down. Super, super common, especially post-COVID, because it's harder to collaborate over Zoom, it turns out. It takes new hires a very long time to be effective. That's also very, very common. 3 months, 6 months, even 9 months, I've heard stories. And this is a fun one. Oh, we failed our audit because we don't have any documentation. Oops. And I've heard this story again over and over and over, especially in kind of more some of the regulated industries, for example. So this is where, obviously, C4 can help. So for those of you who don't know what C4 is, it's essentially a set of hierarchical abstractions, software systems, containers, components, and code. And it's a set of hierarchical static structure diagrams that allow you to showcase different levels of detail, draw a bunch of different diagrams at different levels of detail. And the concept here is diagrams as maps. And it turns out these different levels of diagrams at different levels of detail are great for different audiences. Jackie Reed said this yesterday. You know, the system context diagram is great for literally everybody. And as you start drilling down into the detail, you lose more of those non-technical characters, and it just gets much more towards developers and architects. So that's a really nice summary of C4. It's a set of abstractions, a set of diagram types, it's notation independent, and it's also tooling independent. Turns out, since I created C4, it's being taught in a whole bunch of universities now. So I have a bunch of tooling called Structurizer. There's a kind of paid hosted cloud service. All the other stuff is open source and free. But I give free access to universities, and there are 94 now signed up. So these universities are teaching C4 because my tooling only supports C4. People ask me, well, what alternatives exist to C4? And there aren't any, which is nuts. It's absolutely crazy to say now in 2025 that there still aren't any alternatives to C4. Most people are down here doing the kind of ad hoc boxes and arrows thing. Where's my pointer gone? There it is. Come back. Most people are down here doing random boxes and arrows. C4 gives you some structure because it forces you to think about abstractions. UML gives you a more formalized, standardized, defined notation, but it doesn't really help you in terms of abstractions. And of course, what you could do is you could plug both things together. But apart from that, there's nothing else. You can substitute Archimate and SysML for UML, but there's not really much else going on here, unfortunately. Some success stories. This was nice to hear. This was said to me late last year. We adopted C4, and some of our engineers are no longer scared to make changes. You know, organizations have a bunch of technical debt. It's kind of hard to get your head around. It turns out they drew up some C4 diagrams. They were able to clearly identify the areas where technical debt existed, and that gave them baseline for moving forward and fixing it. I did a workshop with an organization. We drafted out a C4 component diagram of one of their C#.NET apps. And they did a pretty good job first time round. It was a bunch of components organized into architectural layers, and all of the arrows pointed downwards. And I saw this diagram, and I thought, this looks too perfect. And so I said, are you sure this diagram is correct? Because it looks too perfect. And they said, we think it's correct. And I said, well, that's not really what I'm asking here. So we went and got their laptop, and we fired up Visual Studio, and we identified the components, and we started adding the arrows they'd forgotten about. And at the end of this short exercise, I needed 10 minutes, we had arrows going downwards and upwards and sideways and cutting across things. And one person piped up in the group and said, oh, when we change this thing always is broken. And we never realized they were connected in the code, but now they could see it. So again, it's a great way to understand your starting state for refactoring. Same is true with architecture modernization. You can't do why can't I say the word? You can't do modernization if you don't understand your starting state. You know, a refactoring is simply current state, future state, transition. If you don't understand the current state, you're basically stuck. So the C4 workshops are a big part of the way I teach architecture. They're a big part of what I do, of course. And the workshops where we draw diagrams of an organization's products and systems are just fabulous. So at the start of the day, with that initial 30-minute exercise, all the diagrams are a complete car crash. I expect that. I kind of set people up to fail. I admit that. We go through the review process. We introduce C4. And we restart the exercise. We say, right, go and draw some C4 system context and container diagrams for your product. And the diagrams we get they're not perfect, but they're magnitudes better than the morning. Now, what's interesting from my perspective, is I go into most of these clients and I have no idea what these people do. I don't know how they're organized. I don't know what technologies they're using. I don't know what their systems are. I don't know what their landscape is. I literally know nothing. And I still know nothing after that first 30-minute exercise. And nobody else does either. So after we do the second iteration of the diagrams, so imagine we've got like 8 groups in a room, and they've all organized around services or products or something. I can now run around the room and help all these people draw their diagrams. And team over here, team A, will have some dependency on system X. And we can have some conversations and figure out what that line should look like. And over here is team X, looking after product or service or system X. And they're drawing their system context diagram. And I'll say to them, I think team A has an inbound dependency on you. And they're like, no, it doesn't. I'm like, yeah, it does. So I go back over here and like, do you actually call system X? And they're like, yeah, we've mostly moved away, but there's this one kind of legacy API that, thank you. And I go back over here and say, yep, you've got an inbound dependency. And we kind of craft up this landscape diagram. And at the end of the day, and this whole process literally just takes a day, we've got a bunch of really nice C4 drill down diagrams for some of their products. And we've also started to build a map of their entire landscape. And they've never seen this before just because it's been too much of an effort to put together. This is really interesting. I see lots of organizations who are wanting their teams to be autonomous and to work in autonomous fashions and also to craft up architecture documentation in an autonomous fashion. But the organizations still want a top-down map of everything. Now, you have to ask why. Like, if your teams are autonomous, can't you just trust that everything is going to work? And that's not sufficient, apparently. So yeah, many organizations want a top-down view of the world. And it turns out to do that, you need to improve your maturity around things like diagramming. So I've been crafting up this software architecture diagramming maturity model. Most teams are down here, they're doing nothing, or they're building those really horrible diagrams. C4 gets you to level 3. This is where you've got some defined abstractions with a nicely defined notation. Flip the switch and go from diagramming to modeling. That gets you to level 4. Level 5 is where a lot of organizations, lots of clients of mine are now working. Not only are they doing architecture modeling, but they're doing architecture modeling across teams. Once you start doing architecture modeling across teams, and you're sharing model elements across teams, you can do things like automatically generate a landscape diagram. So for example, imagine you have 3 teams in your organization, A, B, and C. They're looking after products, A, B, and C. Each individual team has their own individual set of architecture diagrams. The top-down enterprise architecture folks, the top-down central architecture people, they want that diagram on the right. And they don't want to have to craft it in Visio. They want it generated automatically. And it turns out you can do that. I have a bunch of tooling called Structurizer. There's a little set of blog posts on my Patreon that tells you exactly how to do that. Moving away slightly from diagrams, but not really. Design, decisions, and direction. I've had a lot of my clients say this to me. Our engineering teams are not considering the architectural drivers, so requirements, quality attributes, constraints, principles. They're missing key design inputs. Or they're saying things like this, our teams are not considering the trade-offs of the decisions they are making. And do you know why this is happening? That. If people are crafting out these horrible diagrams, they can't see or challenge or evaluate or review the solutions, so sure, they're going to be missing out on a whole bunch of stuff. How do you fix that problem? This is in my talk from last time. The talk from last time was called The Lost Art of Software Design, and it tells you exactly why this sort of stuff happens and how to fix it. But the kind of too long didn't watch is this. Diagrams are a fabulous checklist, visual checklist for making design decisions. The C4 system context diagram forces you to ask a bunch of questions. Answer those questions, and you can successfully draw something like a context diagram. Zoom into the containers, and it's a different set of questions. It's talking about technology choices and responsibilities and that sort of thing. Answer those questions, and you can draft up a C4 container diagram. And the whole thing about architecture diagrams is that they should force you to have meaningful discussions. You should be able to ask meaningful questions on top of those diagrams. If you don't put effort into crafting good diagrams, the questions you have to ask are this. Why have you used different colors? What do the arrows mean? Why is everything a different shape or a different size? This is kind of some of the stuff that Jackie talked about yesterday. This is all visual noise. Right, fix these issues, and these are not hard to fix, and you get some much more interesting questions popping out there. I saw this in one of my workshops last week. You have two applications and a line between them, but it's unlabeled. Okay, so you have two applications. How are they talking? Oh, it's a function call. Nope, wrong answer. If it's a function call, you should have one box, not two. Oh, it must be REST then. Right, let's go and dig into this. So you can start to ask some really interesting kind of technical questions and try and truly understand what we're dealing with here. So richer diagrams lead to richer design discussions. That's essentially what I'm saying. I hear this a lot from my clients. Our developers are constantly revisiting past decisions. This is easy to fix. ADRs, done. Right, every time you make a significant decision, craft up an ADR, go through the RFC process if you want to. Yeah, this is not particularly hard to resolve. It just needs some time to put this stuff in place. And I want to finish with this. Architecture is not only for architects. The value of a shared common language is super, super powerful. And this is where, again, the C4 model comes back into play. So the system context diagram is literally useful for all audiences, technical and non-technical. As you zoom in, the C4 container diagram is really useful for architects and developers. It turns out, and this is a happy accident, it turns out that the container diagram is also really useful for infrastructure people, DevOps people. I get DevOps as a culture, but teams have DevOps people, whatever. It's also used for security people, compliance people. So there's a whole bunch of kind of, and also technical testers. There's a whole bunch of like technical and semi-technical people that really like the container diagrams. And that helps fix this problem. And I've seen this a lot. You've got all of these developers doing developer stuff, and all of these DevOps, ops and infrastructure people doing Terraform and AWS and CloudFormation. And they don't talk because they're in different worlds or in different languages. The boundary contexts are different, of course. And it turns out that C4 helps bridge this gap. And I know this because a bunch of my clients have invited their DevOps people and ops people onto my workshops. Now, my workshops are really for architects and developers, but I'm like, yeah, feel free, bring them along. And it turns out they find it really useful. The same is true with product owners. I've had a bunch of product owners on my workshops, and they've left saying, oh, now we understand what the teams are actually building, which is kind of wonderful. I did a workshop last year, and the client invited one of their user experience leads along. And during the first iteration of the design exercise, she took a back seat. She's like, this is not my world. I don't design software. I don't know really what was going on. I can't add any value. And I kind of felt a bit sorry for her because she'd been dragged along by her boss. We do the C4 intro. We do the second iteration of the diagrams. She took the lead on the context diagram. She's like, right, I'm taking the lead. I'm the UX person. Describe to me how we're going to make this system work from a UX perspective. What's the user journey, the customer journey, et cetera, et cetera. What features are we providing our user? What accessibility do we need to provide our user? And she was just going for it, and it was incredible to see. She basically drove that whole thing by herself. So this shows the power of a common language. It's useful outside of the kind of technical domain. I've had product owners after my workshop say that they ask the teams this now. So they're going through a set of changes. They're picking stuff off the backlog. And the product owners will show me the diagrams that you're going to use for this change. Or maybe show me which C4 containers you are planning to change as a part of this change set, this feature, which again is kind of awesome. And as I said, architecture is not just for architects. I work with a bunch of organizations, and they want to grow the architects of tomorrow. They want to push their software developers and engineers through my workshop to expose people to what this whole architecture world is all about, of course. And sometimes I run workshops, and organizations are very hesitant to bring developers along. And after the workshop, they literally say this to my face: "This is awesome. I wish we'd invited the engineers." I'm like, I know. I do tell organizations you should make as many people, you should invite as many people as possible, because I think what a lot of organizations do is they invite the senior architects and they want to validate these techniques before giving them to the masses, and I don't think that's a good approach. The flat self-organizing teams thing. So 10 plus years ago, one of the first workshops I ran was in one of the Nordic countries, and I presented the slide, and I got so much backlash, it was unbelievable. Because in many Nordic cultures, everybody's equal. That's kind of built into the culture. And therefore, they were organizing their teams in the same way. And I said, does it work? And they said, yes, absolutely. And I therefore used this story in the subsequent years and said, well, I have seen this work, and it works here, but it doesn't work in other cultures. I've been going back to some of those same customers in those same countries over the past 5 years, and they've said this doesn't work for them anymore. And there's been a huge shift, a 180-degree shift away from just thinking flat teams are the default to something perhaps a bit more structured, which I think is kind of fascinating. Some takeaways. The backlash against architects right back in the early 2000s is real. We can't deny that. But the technical leadership role never went away. And the technical leadership role is essential for all engineering teams. You don't need architects. We could call them tech leads or principal engineers or staff plus engineers, but the tech lead role is essential. And many teams are still missing some basic engineering fundamentals that prevent them being high-performing teams. They're essentially trying to optimize team performance, but they don't have those basics in place. And as I said at the start, you can't optimize team performance without good technical foundations. A lot of this is about improving your architectural capability and architectural maturity. And you've seen this at this event. This is a photo I took at the Upfest talk upstairs yesterday. They created an architecture guild. Look at that. Improve understanding and documentation of shared architecture. I literally had a client say this exact same thing to me this week. C4 model allows you to do this across technical and non-technical domains. Don't take my word. Tons of stuff online. Decathlon, you can see they had the same sort of thing, improving their architectural processes at scale. C4's in there. Spotify have done the same thing. They've taken C4, slightly modified it. Boots in the UK, same thing. And I found a talk a couple of weeks ago, which is rebuilding an architecture practice with DDD. There's not much DDD in here, but C4 does feature quite heavily, of course. So really, what am I trying to say? We still need basic fundamentals. We still need the technical stuff, and it's up to us to grow this in our organizations looking forward. Thank you very much. We have 16 seconds for questions.
I'm going to speak very fast. How can we keep C4 updated? Tooling to auto-generate them from code? Manual updates are left on goodwill and become outdated, leading to more misconception.
Okay, so 2 seconds. Option 1 includes have you updated diagrams in your definition of done, in your pull requests, or yes, lean on automatic generation from code.
Good, next question. Is AI any good at generating C4 models?
Nope. Move on.
Good, next question. Richer diagrams lead to richer design decisions. Isn't this contradicting? If you can't draw a sufficiently simpler diagram, your design is too complicated.
That's why I teach C4.
Right, so here's How does the C4 model fit together with EAM tools? Are they fully separated, or do you see any connection? And if yes, which one and how to do it practically? I looked up what EAM tools are.
Oh, good.
Enterprise asset management, I guess. Hope
So
that's
are we
correct.
saying like ServiceNow, Backstage, that sort of thing? So answer is they do fit quite nicely. Bigger organizations tend to register products and services in these EAM tools. And then you can use that as a basis for scoping things like C4 diagrams. Some tools allow you to put diagrams in those tools. Others allow you to point to external resources. So there is a link.
Wonderful. Let us thank Simon again.
Thank you.